store manager kicks out elderly woman in Biden-Harris shirt, unaware her son owns the store. It was a crisp fall morning at Anderson's Marketplace, a bustling neighborhood grocery store known for its friendly atmosphere and fresh produce. Customers meandered through the aisles, pushing carts laden with essentials and chatting with familiar faces. Outside, the hum of daily life was occasionally punctuated by the clink of shopping carts and snippets of cheerful conversation. Among the crowd was Doris Reed, a petite woman in her late 70s, her silver hair tucked under a vibrant Biden-Harris cap and her jacket adorned with a matching campaign pin. She shuffled toward the store's entrance with a determined but gentle gait, clutching her reusable grocery bags. Doris had been a regular customer at Anderson's for years. It was her go-to store not just for its quality goods but for the sense of community it provided. Today, however, as she approached the automatic doors, she noticed something odd. A man in a dark suit, standing rigidly near the store entrance, eyed her with a sharpness that was both unfamiliar and unnerving. He wore a name tag that read Edward Brooks, store manager, and his posture radiated authority, albeit the kind that leaned toward intimidation rather than leadership. Doris smiled politely as she passed him, but Edward didn't return the gesture. Instead, his eyes zeroed in on her hat, the bright blue lettering unmistakable even from a distance. His jaw tightened, and his lips curled into a faint sneer. "Excuse me," Edward called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the busy store. Doris paused mid-step, turning slowly to face him. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice kind but tinged with confusion. Edward took a step forward, his hands clasped behind his back in an almost theatrical display of authority. "Ma'am," he began, his tone clipped, "we have a dress code here at Anderson's. We expect our customers to respect the neutral environment we strive to maintain." Doris blinked, her confusion deepening. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm not sure I understand. Is there something wrong with what I'm wearing?" Edward's gaze flicked pointedly to her hat and then back to her face. "That," he said sharply, "is the problem. We don't allow political messaging of any kind inside this store. It's disruptive and could make other customers uncomfortable." Doris's eyebrows knitted together, and she instinctively touched the brim of her cap. "This hat?" she asked, her voice rising slightly in disbelief. "It's just a hat. I've worn it before, and no one's ever said anything." "Well, I'm saying something now," Edward retorted, his tone growing more impatient. "If you want to shop here today, you'll need to remove it or leave." Around them, a few customers had begun to take notice. Some slowed their pace as they passed, their curious glances flickering between Doris and Edward. A man in his 30s, pushing a cart with a toddler sitting in the seat, stopped a few feet away, pretending to examine a display of canned goods as he listened in. Doris looked around, her cheeks flushing as she realized they were drawing an audience. "I don't understand why this is suddenly an issue," she said, her voice trembling slightly but still firm. "I've been shopping here for years. This hat hasn't bothered anyone before." Edward's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I'm not going to argue with you," he said, his voice lowering to a stern growl. "Rules are rules. Either comply or I'll have to ask you to leave." Doris opened her mouth to respond, but her words faltered as she saw the way Edward was looking at her. Not with concern or understanding, but with a coldness that made her stomach churn. She glanced around again, hoping for support from the other shoppers, but most averted their eyes, unwilling to get involved. Except for one, a young woman in a cashier's uniform, who had been stocking shelves nearby, straightened up and approached cautiously. Her name tag read Marta, and her wide, dark eyes darted nervously between Doris and Edward. "Excuse me, Mr. Brooks," she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think Mrs. Reed meant to cause any trouble. She's a regular here, and she's always been very kind." Edward turned to Marta, his expression sharp enough to make her flinch. "This is none of your concern, Marta," he said curtly. "Get back to your station." Marta hesitated, glancing at Doris, who offered her a small, grateful smile despite the tension. "Yes, sir," Marta murmured before retreating, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Doris took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice steady now despite the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. "I respect your position, but I don't think a hat should be grounds for denying someone the right to shop." Edward crossed his arms, his sneer deepening. "And I don't think it's your place to question store policy," he shot back. "We have a reputation to uphold, and I won't let anyone, customer or not, jeopardize that." The man with the toddler, who had been listening intently, finally spoke up. "Come on, man," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "It's just a hat. You're really going to kick her out over this?" Edward turned sharply toward him, his eyes narrowing. "Mind your own business," he snapped. "This doesn't concern you." "Actually," the man replied, his tone growing bolder, "it concerns everyone here. You're making a scene over nothing and embarrassing her for no reason." Several other customers, emboldened by his words, began murmuring their agreement. Edward's jaw tightened, and he took a step back, his gaze sweeping over the growing crowd. For a moment, he seemed unsure of himself, but then his sneer returned, more defiant than ever. "Rules are rules," he repeated, his voice loud enough to drown out the murmurs. "If you don't like them, you're welcome to shop somewhere else." Doris stood her ground, her chin lifting slightly as she met his gaze. "I don't think this is about rules," she said quietly. "I think this is about you." Edward's sneer faltered, just for a second, before his face hardened again. "You're free to think whatever you want, ma'am," he said coldly. "But you're not welcome here unless you follow the rules." The tension in the air was almost tangible as the crowd watched, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outrage. Doris felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but she refused to back down. She had come here to buy groceries, and she wasn't going to let someone like Edward bully her out of a place she had every right to be. Edward, however, seemed determined to make an example of her. "I'll give you one last chance," he said, his voice icy. "Take off the hat or leave." Doris didn't move. The crowd didn't either. Edward's stare bore into Doris as the tension around them thickened, the once pleasant hum of the store now reduced to hushed whispers and shifting feet. The small crowd that had gathered wasn't dispersing. In fact, more people were stopping to watch the unfolding confrontation. Some exchanged glances of disbelief, while others muttered under their breath, unsure of whether to intervene or stay silent. The man with the toddler was still lingering, his arms crossed and his expression simmering with frustration. Doris remained rooted in place, her posture deceptively calm but her hands gripping the straps of her grocery bags with quiet resolve. She wasn't going to let herself be intimidated, not by Edward or anyone else. She had spent decades standing firm in the face of adversity, and this was no exception. Edward, however, seemed emboldened by the fact that no one had yet taken serious action against him. He straightened his tie with an air of self-importance, glancing pointedly at the crowd as if daring someone to challenge him. "This isn't up for debate, folks," he declared, his voice raised just enough to be heard over the murmurs. "This store has rules, and it's my job to enforce them. If you can't respect that, there are plenty of other places you can shop." "That's ridiculous," came a voice from the back of the crowd. A younger man in a plaid shirt stepped forward, his expression incredulous. "You're treating her like a criminal for wearing a hat. Do you even hear yourself?" Edward's gaze snapped to the man, his eyes narrowing. "And who exactly are you to question me?" he shot back. "Do you work here? Do you know the policies? No? Then maybe you should keep your opinions to yourself." The man's face reddened, but he didn't back down. "I don't need to work here to know this isn't right," he retorted. "You're picking on her because you don't like what she's wearing. That's not enforcing rules. That's just being a bully." The crowd murmured louder in agreement this time, and Edward's face darkened. He glanced at Doris again, his expression hardening as though doubling down on his stance. "I've made my position clear," he said, his voice cold. "If you can't respect the policies of this store, then you don't belong here." Doris finally spoke, her voice calm but resolute. "I've shopped at this store for years," she said, meeting Edward's gaze steadily. "I've never had a problem before. The only thing that's changed is you, Mr. Brooks. Edward flinched at the subtle accusation, but his sneer quickly returned. Well, maybe it's time for some changes, he snapped. This store isn't here to cater to your personal beliefs, ma'am. It's here to serve the community. And that means keeping things neutral and professional. Neutral? Doris echoed, her tone sharp now. What's neutral about singling someone out for wearing a hat you don't agree with? What's professional about embarrassing an elderly woman in front of a crowd? Edward's nostrils flared, and he took a step closer, towering over her. I don't have to justify myself to you, he said, his voice low but threatening. You've been given your options. Either take off the hat or leave. The crowd stirred uneasily, the tension nearing a boiling point. The man with the toddler stepped forward again, his jaw tight. You're really going to throw her out? For what? Wearing a hat you don't like? You think that's going to look good for the store? Edward rounded on him, his patience snapping. You people don't understand, he barked, his voice echoing across the aisles. It's not about the hat. It's about what it represents. We don't need that kind of divisive energy here. And who decides what's divisive? Came another voice. A middle-aged woman holding a basket of produce. She stepped closer, her expression stern. You? Since when do you get to dictate what people can wear? This isn't your store. Edward's face reddened at the remark, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around at the growing crowd, his unease barely concealed. He had expected compliance, not defiance, and the realization seemed to be dawning on him that he might have overplayed his hand. Doris, sensing the shift in the crowd's energy, straightened her shoulders. You keep talking about respect, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. But respect is a two-way street. If you expect it, you have to give it. Edward's eyes flashed with anger, but before he could respond, the younger man in the plaid shirt spoke up again. She's right, he said firmly. You can't demand respect while you're out here disrespecting her in front of everyone. The murmurs grew louder, and Edward's composure began to crack. His gaze darted between Doris, the crowd, and the other store employees who were now peeking out from behind shelves, their expressions ranging from nervous to outright disapproving. Marta, the cashier who had tried to intervene earlier, caught his eye, and he glared at her as though daring her to speak up again. But Marta didn't need to. The crowd was doing it for her. This isn't about rules, said the middle-aged woman with the produce basket. This is about you trying to impose your own biases on everyone else. You should be ashamed of yourself. Yeah, muttered someone else, and then another. This is wrong. Leave her alone. Edward took a step back, his bravado faltering as the weight of the crowd's disapproval bore down on him. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, he seemed at a loss for what to do. Doris, sensing an opportunity, stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. I've done nothing wrong, she said, and I'm not going anywhere. Edward's face twisted in frustration, his fists clenching at his sides. The murmurs of agreement from the crowd were growing louder now, and he could feel the situation slipping out of his control. His gaze flicked to the front entrance, as though searching for an escape route, but there was none. He was trapped, and he knew it. The crowd continued to close in, their disapproval palpable. Edward, his once confident demeanor now reduced to a fragile shell, stood frozen in place, unsure of how to proceed. Doris remained calm, her steady presence a stark contrast to Edward's crumbling facade. She didn't need to say anything more. The crowd's judgment was loud enough. Edward shifted uncomfortably, his once confident stance faltering as the weight of the crowd's murmurs began to press against him. The man in the plaid shirt crossed his arms, standing defiantly a few feet away, while Doris remained still, her hands clutching her reusable grocery bags like a lifeline. Around them, more shoppers had paused their routines, their carts idling in the aisles as they watched the scene unfold with growing interest and growing judgment. Let's get one thing straight, Edward said finally, his voice sharp but cracking at the edges. This is my store to manage, and I don't owe anyone here an explanation. Rules are rules. You keep saying that, the middle-aged woman with the basket of produce interjected. her voice tinged with sarcasm. "But funny how the rules only seem to apply when it suits you. Why don't you tell us where exactly these rules are written down?" Edward's jaw tightened, his gaze darting toward the front of the store as if hoping for backup, but none came. The employees standing at their stations were conspicuously avoiding his gaze now, their reluctance to support him palpable. Marta, the cashier, hovered near the edge of the produce section, her lips pressed tightly together as she watched the exchange with thinly veiled unease. "Look," Edward said, turning his focus back to Doris, as if doubling down would restore his authority. "I don't make the rules, I enforce them. And if you can't follow them, you're not welcome here." Doris raised her chin, her expression calm but resolute. "And what rule is it exactly that I've broken, Mr. Brooks?" The question seemed to catch Edward off guard, and he blinked at her, his mouth opening and closing as he scrambled for a response. You've broken the rule about maintaining neutrality in the store," he said finally, his voice growing louder as if volume alone could lend credibility to his words. "Neutrality?" Doris repeated, her voice tinged with incredulity. "I'm buying groceries, not making a political speech." "You're wearing that hat," Edward snapped, pointing at her Biden-Harris cap as if it were a weapon. "It's provocative. It's divisive. It's a piece of fabric," the man in the plaid shirt interrupted, his voice rising over Edward's. "She's not bothering anyone. You're the one making it divisive." "Exactly," another voice chimed in from the growing crowd, a younger woman standing near the bakery section. "If she's not breaking any laws, what gives you the right to kick her out?" Edward's face flushed with frustration, the cracks in his composure becoming more pronounced. "I don't need to explain myself to any of you," he barked, his voice carrying across the store. "This is my decision, and if you don't like it, you can shop somewhere else." The crowd murmured louder now, their disapproval rippling through the air like an approaching storm. Doris remained silent, her calm presence a stark contrast to Edward's fraying demeanor. She didn't need to say anything. The crowd was speaking for her. "You're making a fool of yourself," the middle-aged woman said bluntly, stepping closer. "And worse, you're embarrassing this store." Edward turned on her, his finger jabbing in the air. "If you don't stop interfering," he growled, "I'll have you removed too." "Go ahead," the woman shot back, her tone unflinching. "Call security. Let's see how that works out for you." Edward hesitated, his bravado faltering under the weight of her challenge. He glanced at the employees again, his eyes landing on Marta, who stood frozen near the produce section. "Marta," he barked, his voice cracking with frustration. "Go get security." Marta flinched at the command, her wide eyes darting between Edward and the crowd. "Mr. Brooks," she began hesitantly, her voice barely audible. "I don't think this is now," Edward roared, cutting her off. The sharpness of his tone sent a ripple of discomfort through the crowd, and Marta shrank back, her hands trembling as she reluctantly turned to leave. But before she could take more than a few steps, another voice rang out, clear and confident. "That won't be necessary." All eyes turned toward the front of the store, where a tall man in a crisp button-down shirt and jeans had just stepped through the entrance. His presence commanded attention, and the crowd instinctively parted to let him through. He carried himself with an air of quiet authority, his expression calm but serious as he approached. Edward froze, his face draining of color as he recognized the man. "Mr. Reed," he stammered, his tone suddenly meek. I wasn't expecting you today." The man, Doris's son, though no one else in the crowd knew it yet, didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked straight to his mother, his gaze softening as he reached her side. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked gently, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Doris smiled faintly, her composure unwavering. "I'm fine," she said simply. "But it seems there's been a bit of a misunderstanding." Mr. Reed turned his attention to Edward then, his expression hardening. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice low but carrying a weight that made Edward flinch. "Is that what we're calling this?" Edward's mouth opened and closed again, his usual arrogance replaced by a thinly veiled panic. I was just enforcing the rules," he stammered. "You know how important it is to maintain a neutral environment." "Neutral?" Mr. Reed interrupted, his tone sharp. "What's neutral about targeting a customer because of what she's wearing? What's neutral about humiliating an elderly woman in front of a crowd?" Edward swallowed hard, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I didn't mean to." "To what?" Mr. Reed pressed, his voice rising just enough to cut through Edward's excuses. "To harass a loyal customer? To embarrass my mother? Or to make this store look like a place where bias and bullying are the norm?" The crowd murmured in agreement, the weight of their judgment pressing down on Edward like a physical force. Marta, who had stopped in her tracks when Mr. Reed arrived, was now watching with wide eyes, her expression a mix of relief and vindication. Edward's gaze darted around the room, his desperation palpable as he realized he was rapidly losing control of the situation. I was just trying to." "To what?" Mr. Reed demanded again, his voice cold and unrelenting. "To justify your behavior? To save face? Let me make one thing clear, Mr. Brooks. This isn't your store to run as you see fit. It's mine." The crowd's collective gasp filled the store like a rolling wave. Edward's face drained of color, his carefully cultivated facade of authority crumbling under the weight of Mr. Reed's revelation. His jaw worked silently, as though searching for words that refused to come. The whispers among the shoppers grew louder now, the tension in the room reaching an almost unbearable pitch. You own the store?" Edward finally managed to choke out, his voice thin and trembling. Mr. Reed's gaze didn't waver, his calm demeanor now laced with an unmistakable edge of authority. "That's right," he said, his tone cool but firm. "I own this store, and as of this moment, I'm starting to wonder if I made the wrong choice putting someone like you in charge of it." The weight of his words sent a visible shudder through Edward, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his gaze darting nervously around the room as though looking for an escape route. But there was none. The crowd had closed ranks around them, their expressions a mix of outrage and quiet satisfaction as they watched the man who had lorded over them finally brought to heel. "Sir," Edward stammered, his voice desperate now, I was only trying to maintain order. You have to understand, she what?" Mr. Reed interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through Edward's excuses like a blade. "She wore a hat you didn't like? She came into a store she's shopped at for years and expected to be treated with the same respect as anyone else? Help me understand, Mr. Brooks, because from where I'm standing, all I see is you abusing your authority and humiliating a loyal customer. My mother, no less. In front of half the neighborhood." Edward flinched at the emphasis on "my mother," his face flushing with embarrassment and fear. "I didn't know she was your mother," he blurted out, his tone defensive. "And why should that matter?" Mr. Reed shot back, his voice rising slightly. "Would you have treated her any differently if she wasn't? Would you have respected her then? Or is this just how you deal with anyone who doesn't fit into your narrow definition of what's acceptable?" The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, several people nodding in agreement. The younger man in the plaid shirt stepped forward again, his arms still crossed as he leveled Edward with a hard stare. "He's right," the man said firmly. "You didn't treat her with respect because you didn't want to. You thought you could get away with it because she's just an old lady in a hat. But you were wrong." Edward spun toward the man, his face contorting with frustration. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped, though his voice lacked the bite it had carried earlier. "You don't know what it's like to manage a store like this. You don't understand the pressure I'm under." "Pressure?" Mr. Reed said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You think this is about pressure? Let me tell you something, Mr. Brooks. Managing a store is about more than just enforcing rules. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels welcome. Customers, employees, everyone. And if you can't handle that responsibility, then maybe you're not the right person for this job." Edward opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked around the room again, his desperation mounting as he realized that no one was coming to his defense. Even Marta, who had been cowering near the edge of the crowd, was now standing a little straighter, her expression one of quiet defiance. "I'm sorry," Edward said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "You didn't mean for it to go this far?" Mr. Reed repeated, his voice rising again. "Then what exactly did you mean? Did you mean to harass an elderly woman? Did you mean to undermine the values this store is supposed to represent? Or did you just mean to throw your weight around because you thought no one would hold you accountable?" The crowd murmured louder now, their disapproval of Edward growing more vocal. Several people were shaking their heads, their expressions ranging from disgust to outright anger. Even Mrs. Carmichael, who had been quietly observing the scene from a distance, finally spoke up. "He's right," she said, her voice firm despite her age. "I've seen you treat other customers the same way, Edward. You think you can bully people because you're the manager, but that doesn't give you the right to disrespect anyone." Edward turned toward her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Mrs. Carmichael," he began, his tone pleading, "I was just trying to—" "To what?" she interrupted, her voice steady and unwavering. "To prove that you're in charge? Well, congratulations. You've proved it. But at what cost?" The crowd murmured in agreement again, and Edward's shoulders slumped as the weight of their judgment pressed down on him. He turned back to Mr. Reed, his expression one of defeat. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Then don't say anything," Mr. Reed replied coldly, "because at this point, there's nothing you can say that will undo what you've done. The only question now is whether you're willing to take responsibility for your actions." Edward's face crumpled, and for a moment, it looked as though he might argue. But then he glanced at the crowd, at the angry faces staring back at him, and seemed to realize that he had no choice. He nodded stiffly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice trembling. "To you, Mrs. Reed, and to the rest of the customers. I was wrong." The apology hung in the air, but it didn't seem to satisfy anyone. The damage had been done, and no amount of words could undo it. Mr. Reed nodded curtly, his expression still hard. "We'll deal with this later," he said. "But for now, I suggest you step back and let someone else take over." Edward hesitated, his pride warring with his sense of self-preservation. But finally, he nodded again and stepped aside, his shoulders slumping as he retreated toward the back of the store. Edward shuffled away from the center of the crowd, his face pale and clammy. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, and yet the murmurs around him only seemed to grow louder. The once confident manager now looked like a man trying to make himself invisible, but the judgmental stares from the gathered crowd refused to let him fade into the background. The man in the plaid shirt shook his head in visible disgust, muttering something to the woman next to him. The younger woman near the bakery crossed her arms tightly, her lips pursed in open disapproval. Doris, still standing near the middle of the circle, glanced around at the crowd and then back at Edward. For the first time, a flicker of sadness crossed her face. Not pity for the man, but a sadness for what the situation had become. Still, she stayed silent, letting her son hold the floor. It wasn't her moment to speak. Not yet. Mr. Reed's eyes followed Edward as the man moved reluctantly toward the back wall, his shoulders slumping further with each step. "Don't go too far, Mr. Brooks," Reed called after him, his voice ringing with authority. "We're not done here." Edward froze mid-step, turning back toward his boss with the hesitant, guilt-ridden look of a child caught stealing candy. I thought you wanted me to step back," he stammered. "Oh, I do," Reed replied, his voice cool and sharp. "But stepping back doesn't mean walking away from the mess you made. You're going to stay here, front and center, until we've sorted this out properly. And trust me, Mr. Brooks, we will sort it out." The crowd murmured approvingly, several nodding in agreement. Edward's face flushed a deep red, and his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it, snapping his jaw shut and staring at the floor instead. "Now," Reed continued, turning his attention back to the crowd, "I want to make one thing very clear to everyone here. This is not how Anderson's Marketplace operates. This store has been a part of this community for years, and its mission has always been to serve every customer with respect and dignity. What happened here today goes against everything this store stands for. The crowd murmured louder this time, several people breaking into scattered applause. Marta, who had been hovering near the produce section, straightened her posture slightly, her expression softening as Reed spoke. Even the middle-aged woman with the basket of produce nodded approvingly, her earlier anger replaced by a look of cautious optimism. But Reed continued, his voice growing sharper, "I can't fix this on my own. Respect isn't just something that comes from the top down. It's something we all have to commit to. That means holding each other accountable when we fall short. And it means standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." He paused, letting his words sink in. Several people in the crowd nodded, and a few exchanged quiet murmurs of agreement. Edward, however, stood frozen near the back of the circle, his face a mask of humiliation and barely contained frustration. "I want to thank every single one of you who spoke up today," Reed said, his tone softening slightly. "It's not easy to confront authority, especially in a public setting like this. But your courage and integrity are exactly what this store and this community needs." The younger man in the plaid shirt smiled faintly, nodding at Reed in silent acknowledgement. The woman near the bakery uncrossed her arms and offered a small, approving smile. Even Marta seemed to relax slightly, her shoulders lowering as she exhaled a quiet sigh of relief. Reed turned back to his mother then, his expression softening even further. "And you, Mom," he said gently, his voice filled with warmth. "You've always been my role model for standing up for what's right. Thank you for staying strong today." Doris smiled, her face glowing with quiet pride. "Thank you, son," she replied softly. "But I think this moment is about more than just me. It's about reminding all of us that respect is a choice we have to make every day." The crowd clapped this time, the sound filling the store with a warmth that hadn't been there before. For a moment, it seemed as though the tension had lifted entirely. But then Edward shifted uncomfortably, drawing the crowd's attention back to him like a moth to a flame. "What about me?" Edward blurted out suddenly, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "Am I just supposed to stand here and be humiliated in front of everyone? I've worked hard to keep this store running. Doesn't that count for anything?" The room fell silent, the applause dying abruptly as every eye turned to Edward. His face was flushed, his chest heaving slightly as he glared at Reed, his earlier deference now replaced with a simmering resentment. Reed's gaze hardened. "What counts, Mr. Brooks," he said slowly, his voice steady but icy, "is how you treat people. Your position here isn't about power or control. It's about leadership, and leadership starts with respect." "I was enforcing the rules," Edward shot back, his voice rising. "Isn't that what you wanted me to do? To keep things in order?" "Order doesn't mean bullying," Reed replied sharply. "It doesn't mean targeting someone because you disagree with their choices. And it certainly doesn't mean creating a hostile environment for our customers." Edward's jaw tightened, and he looked away, unable to meet Reed's piercing gaze. The crowd watched in silence, their earlier disapproval now tempered with a quiet sense of vindication. Edward had pushed too far, and now he was paying the price. Reed let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. "You've made it clear that you don't understand what this store stands for," he said finally. "And that makes me question whether you belong here at all." Edward's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "You can't mean that," he said quickly. I've been with this store for years. You can't just..." "I can," Reed interrupted, his tone firm. "And if I have to, I will. But for now, I'm giving you a choice, Mr. Brooks. You can either step down from your position voluntarily, or you can stay and face the consequences of your actions. The decision is yours." The crowd murmured again, their expressions a mix of approval and anticipation. Edward looked around desperately, his gaze darting from face to face as though searching for an ally. But no one stepped forward to defend him. Even Marta, who had once feared his wrath, stood silently by, her expression unreadable. Edward's shoulders slumped, and he looked at the floor, his earlier bravado completely gone. For the first time, he seemed to realize that he was truly alone. Edward trudged toward the back office, his posture hunched, his face beet red. The humiliation of stepping down in front of a crowd, many of whom he had lorded over for years, was unbearable. The sound of clapping and murmured satisfaction from the crowd followed him like a trail of shame, making his steps falter. His hands trembled as he reached for his keys, the metallic jingle a bitter reminder of his rapidly slipping authority. The crowd didn't disperse. If anything, they seemed to swell with more onlookers filtering in, drawn by the electric energy of justice being served. Whispers turned to hushed conversations as people shared their own grievances about Edward's behavior, their collective frustration bubbling to the surface now that his reign of intimidation was over. "You know," the man in the plaid shirt said loudly enough for Edward to hear, "this isn't the first time he's thrown his weight around. I've seen him belittle employees just for making small mistakes." "Good riddance." Edward flinched at the words but didn't dare turn back. The middle-aged woman with the produce basket chimed in. "He once made me wait 20 minutes for a price check and then accused me of wasting his time when I asked about it. Can't say I'll miss him." A few shoppers laughed at her remark, their voices tinged with the satisfaction of seeing karma unfold. Even Marta, who had remained silent for most of the ordeal, finally spoke up. "He yelled at me last week because a register froze. Told me I was lucky to have a job here. Well, looks like the tables have turned." The crowd laughed again, louder this time. Edward's pace quickened as he neared the office, his face burning with the sting of public judgment. But before he could escape entirely, Mr. Reed called out to him, his voice calm but commanding. "Mr. Brooks, not so fast." Edward froze mid-step, his heart sinking. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned back to face Reed, who was now standing at the center of the crowd with his mother by his side. Doris's calm, steady presence only seemed to amplify the contrast between her quiet dignity and Edward's crumbling facade. "You seem to think that stepping down ends this conversation," Reed said, his tone measured but laced with authority. "But there's still one more matter we need to address." Edward's mouth went dry. What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky. Reed gestured toward the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the shoppers and employees who had gathered. "This isn't just about you and me, Mr. Brooks," he said. "It's about the damage you've done to the store and the people in it. These customers and employees deserve better than the treatment you've given them. And they deserve an apology." Edward's eyes widened in horror. "An apology?" he echoed, his voice rising in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," Reed replied, his tone sharp. "You spent years treating these people like they were beneath you, like their opinions didn't matter. Well, now it's time to face them and take responsibility for your actions." The crowd erupted into murmurs of approval, several people nodding and crossing their arms as they waited for Edward's response. Doris watched silently, her expression unreadable but her presence unwavering. Edward looked around desperately, his gaze darting from face to face in search of sympathy or support, but there was none to be found. Even the employees who had once feared him now stood firm, their expressions resolute as they watched him squirm. I don't think that's necessary," Edward stammered, his voice weak. "I've already stepped down. Isn't that enough?" "No," Reed said firmly, his gaze steady. "It's not enough. You owe these people an apology, and you're going to give it to them." Edward's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening as he struggled to hold back his frustration. "Fine," he muttered through gritted teeth. "I'm sorry." Reed raised an eyebrow. "Try again," he said. "And this time mean it." Edward's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He took a deep breath, his chest heaving as he forced the words out. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice louder but no less strained. "I'm sorry if I offended anyone or made them feel unwelcome." The crowd remained silent, their unimpressed expressions making it clear that his half-hearted apology wasn't going to cut it. Reed crossed his arms, his gaze unyielding. "Not good enough, Mr. Brooks," he said. "An apology isn't about making yourself feel better. It's about acknowledging the harm you've caused and taking responsibility for it. Try again." Edward's composure cracked further, his shoulders slumping as he realized there was no way out of this. The weight of the crowd's judgment pressed down on him like a physical force, and for the first time, he seemed to truly understand the gravity of his actions. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice quieter but more genuine this time. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you all. I let my position go to my head, and I forgot what it means to lead with respect. I was wrong." The crowd murmured softly, their judgment giving way to a cautious sense of vindication. Reed nodded, his expression softening slightly. "That's a start," he said. "But actions speak louder than words, Mr. Brooks. Remember that." Edward nodded stiffly, his face still pale as he turned and walked toward the back office once more. This time, no one stopped him. The crowd parted to let him pass, their eyes following him until he disappeared from view. Reed turned back to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the shoppers and employees. "Thank you all for standing up for what's right," he said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "This store is here for you, and I promise that moving forward, we'll do everything we can to make it a place where everyone feels welcome." The crowd broke into applause, the sound filling the store like a wave of relief. Doris smiled softly, her pride in her son evident as she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You handled that beautifully," she said quietly. Reed smiled back at her, his expression warm. "I learned from the best," he replied. Edward's footsteps echoed as he moved toward the back office, his pace slow and reluctant, like a condemned man heading toward his fate. The weight of the crowd's disapproval pressed against his back, each murmur and quiet chuckle stinging more than he cared to admit. His hands were trembling slightly, but he clenched them into fists, as if that might help him hold on to what little shred of authority he still believed he had. Before he could disappear behind the office door, however, Reed's voice cut through the murmurs like a whip. "Not so fast, Mr. Brooks." Edward froze mid-step, his back stiffening. He turned slowly, his face pale but his eyes filled with a flicker of defiance. "What now?" he asked, his tone low but strained, like a cornered animal baring its teeth. Reed took a measured step forward, his expression calm but uncompromising. "I don't think you understand what taking responsibility actually means," he said, his voice sharp enough to silence the remaining murmurs from the crowd. "You think stepping into that office and slinking away is going to make this right? It won't. Not even close." Edward's face flushed, his earlier panic now replaced by simmering resentment. "I already said I'd step down," he snapped, his voice rising with indignation. "What more do you want from me?" "What I want," Reed replied, his voice calm but steely, "is for you to face the people you disrespected, to look them in the eye and admit what you did and why you were wrong. Running away isn't accountability, Mr. Brooks. It's cowardice." The crowd murmured in agreement, their earlier anger reigniting as Reed's words struck a chord. The younger man in the plaid shirt nodded emphatically, his arms still crossed as he stared Edward down. "Yeah," he said loudly. "You think you can just walk away and pretend this didn't happen? Not a chance." Edward's gaze darted around the room, his frustration mounting as he realized there would be no escape. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You want me to apologize? To grovel in front of everyone? Is that it? Will that make you all happy?" "It's not about making us happy," the middle-aged woman with the basket of produce interjected, her tone sharp. "It's about owning up to your actions. You can't treat people the way you did and then expect to walk away without consequences." Edward's jaw tightened, and he glared at the woman, his earlier meekness now replaced by raw anger. "You don't know what it's like," he shot back, his voice rising. "Managing a store, dealing with difficult customers, trying to keep things running smoothly. It's not easy. But no, you all just stand there, judging me like you've never made a mistake in your lives." The crowd bristled at his outburst, several people shaking their heads or muttering under their breath. Doris, who had remained quiet up to this point, finally stepped forward, her calm presence immediately drawing the room's attention. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice steady but firm. "None of us are perfect. We've all made mistakes. But the difference between a good leader and a bad one is how they handle those mistakes. Do they learn from them, or do they lash out and blame everyone else? Edward flinched at her words, his gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, it seemed as though he might relent. But then his anger flared again, and he looked back up, his eyes blazing. "You think you're so much better than me?" he demanded, his voice dripping with bitterness. "You think you have the right to stand there and lecture me? You're just a—" "Enough," Reed interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through Edward's tirade like a knife. He stepped closer to Edward, his gaze hard and unrelenting. "Don't you dare speak to her like that." Edward took a half-step back, his anger faltering under Reed's piercing glare. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" Reed demanded, his voice growing colder. "You didn't mean to humiliate her? To disrespect her? To make this store, my store, look like a place where bullies thrive? Because that's exactly what you did, Mr. Brooks. And no amount of excuses is going to change that." The crowd erupted in murmurs again, their frustration with Edward now boiling over. Several people called out words of agreement, their voices rising in a chorus of disapproval. Even Marta, who had been silent for most of the exchange, stepped forward hesitantly, her face pale but her expression determined. "Mr. Reed is right," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as she spoke. "This isn't the first time he's treated customers this way. We've all seen it. We've all been too scared to say anything because he's the manager. But it's not right. It's never been right." Edward spun toward her, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. "Marta," he said, his voice low and strained, "you're supposed to be on my side." Marta flinched but held her ground. "I'm on the side of what's right," she replied firmly, her voice steady now. "And what you've been doing isn't right. It never has been." The crowd murmured louder, several people nodding in agreement. Edward's face twisted with frustration, and he turned back to Reed, his earlier anger now tinged with desperation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. I was just trying to do my job. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand." Reed stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but filled with finality. "Your job, Mr. Brooks, was to lead this store with integrity and respect, and you failed. That's the truth of it. No excuses, no justifications. You failed." Edward's shoulders slumped, his earlier defiance completely gone. He looked around the room one last time, his gaze lingering on the disapproving faces of the crowd, the employees who had once feared him, and finally Doris, who stood calm and resolute, her presence a quiet reminder of the respect he had refused to show. Reed stepped forward again, his voice cold and unrelenting. "Hand over your keys, Mr. Brooks," he said, "and leave. Now." Edward hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached into his pocket. Slowly, reluctantly, he pulled out the keys to the store and held them out. Reed took them without a word, his expression hard as stone. Edward glanced around one last time, his face pale and his eyes filled with bitterness. "You'll regret this," he muttered under his breath, though the words carried no real conviction. He turned and walked toward the exit, his steps slow and heavy as the crowd parted to let him pass. As the door closed behind him, the store fell silent. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, but there was also a sense of relief, a feeling that justice had finally been served. In the end, this isn't just about a disgraced manager or a single moment of humiliation. It's about the choices we make every day and how those choices shape the world around us. Respect, fairness, and empathy aren't just lofty ideals. They're the foundation of any community, any workplace, and any human interaction. Edward's downfall wasn't because of a single mistake, but because of a pattern of arrogance and disrespect, a refusal to see others as equals, as people deserving of dignity. What happened today serves as a reminder that power, no matter how small, should never be used to tear others down. Leadership isn't about control or domination. It's about serving others, about lifting people up and creating an environment where everyone feels valued. When we fail to lead with integrity, we not only lose the respect of others, we lose something far more important: our own humanity. For those watching, consider this. How do you treat the people around you? When faced with a choice, do you stand up for what's right, even if it's uncomfortable, or do you stay silent? Do you use whatever influence you have to build bridges or to burn them? And for those like Edward, perhaps the lesson is even starker. Power and privilege are fleeting. Respect is earned, not demanded. The way we treat others reflects not just on our character, but on the legacy we leave behind. So, as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, if your actions were the last thing people remembered about you, what would they say? How would they tell your story? Because in the end, it's not about the title we hold, but the impact we leave behind. What kind of legacy are you building today?